In the next lesson in Unit 3, we're going to cover the acute cardiovascular responses. I'm going to start lecture out a little bit different today because we're going to actually have one slide on something that is completely not truly related to the cardiovascular system, but is going to be really important in helping you, I think, grasp the concept of cardiovascular responses to exercise. And that is starting with what happens to the sympathetic nervous system. So one of the things that I think becomes most helpful, at least to me, is by picturing a lot of these cardiovascular events as what happens if we increase sympathetic nervous system. And why is that the case? So if we look at this figure here, what we have is just a relative idea of what happens to the two sympathetic hormones, epinephrine and norepinephrine. Right? So again, this is just broad generalization talking about blood concentrations, and we can see at rest here at 0% of our VO2 max through an incremental exercise, which is going from a walk, a jog, a run to an all-out maximal effort exercise. You can see that as exercise intensity increases, especially once we get above about 40% of our VO2 max, that the sympathetic nervous system is going to increase the levels of epinephrine and norepinephrine in the body. And so I think this is going to help be a big change. And while some of these changes, again, this is a systemic change, and we also have the same type of outflow coming from the brain into several areas. So I just wanted to introduce that. We'll talk about hormones later on in the semester, but I think this idea is really something that will help you grasp this concept. Okay, so your objectives today are phrased in a bit of a different way. So what happens during exercise is that we have oxygen demand increased by the muscles, right? We need oxygen to act as that final electron acceptor in the electron transport chain, and therefore we need to get more oxygen so that we can make more ATP by aerobic metabolism. So with that, our metabolic supply, which is our ATP production by aerobic metabolism, must be met with an increase in, our metabolic demand, which is related, of course, to the ATP production, must be met by our supply. So what that means is we have to increase O2 delivery to skeletal muscles, right? We do that by three ways. First, we're going to increase cardiac output, and so that'll be your first objective, is to understand heart rate and stroke volume, which are cardiac output, and how they are altered with exercise. We also have a redistribution of blood flow. So objective number 2 is to understand how blood flow is increased, how we shunt blood from different areas, and how we open up blood flow areas to get more blood to muscle. And then last but not least, will be a very short, but looking at the extraction of oxygen from the blood. So what are the cardiovascular adjustments to exercise? I'll say this. For the most part, I'll highlight, unless I have another picture. I've tried to highlight most of the pictures, but you'll see here that the majority of my pictures have this running guy in them. For almost all cardiovascular adjustments, what we're going to be focusing on is aerobic training. So running, riding a bike, swimming, some type of aerobic exercise, not resistance training, right? There'll only be a few times when we talk about resistance training, and when we do, I'll have a different figure and clearly state resistance training. For now, assume everything is aerobic, some type of aerobic running, right? So one thing that we can say is supply and demand are kept very quickly, right? Within about a second of an increase in demand, our supply starts getting there. So we start getting parasympathetic withdrawal, which is cardiovagal, so decrease in parasympathetic here, nervous system, followed by an increase in sympathetic nervous system, just like we showed in epinephrine and norepinephrine in the blood. We also get increased vasodilation or opening of arterioles to skeletal muscle to increase blood flow there, and an increase in resistance to less active areas, so we force muscle, and the ultimate end result is cardiac output is increased and blood flow to skeletal muscle gets much higher. So let's look at what that looks like in a transition. And again, this is rapid. At the onset of exercise, in both our stroke volume, our heart rate, and cardiac output all began within seconds. So this is the beginning of the exercise here, and you can see within seconds we will increase stroke volume and heart rate, which of course will then increase our cardiac output. So we'll note that this is not an incremental exercise, so this is just going out and running. So let's just say at about 50% of VO2 max. So this would just be setting a pace and running that, right? Within about 2 to 3 minutes, we reach what is considered steady state, which means that our metabolic supply is met by our metabolic demand is met by the metabolic supply, and therefore it plateaus and stays constant until the end of the exercise. During recovery, of course, we then have a decrease in demand, and our supply then, of course, follows that same course that it decreases. So one thing that you'll note here is the time here is about 10 minutes. If you'll remember from the last unit, we talked about EPOC, which is excess post exercise oxygen consumption, and this is what's happening, right? We still have an increase in metabolic demand. It doesn't go to zero just because we stopped running. We need more oxygen for several reasons, including converting lactate and clearing lactate, converting lactate into glucose. We're also refilling oxygen stores in myoglobin and several other different factors. So just note that this isn't an immediate, just because demand stops here of actually doing running, that the metabolic demand still persists for 10 minutes or so, right? And even some of it can persist up to 30 minutes depending on the exercise. So during recovery, though, we see a slow decrease back to resting levels. It depends on several factors: the duration and intensity of exercise. If you ran for a long time or for a very intense exercise, then your recovery is slower, right? And you can just think about that as your oxygen deficit was greater if you were using an intense exercise because you relied on anaerobic energy sources for quite a bit. Another important factor is that training state, and we'll talk about this tomorrow because that'll be what the lecture is over, is training adaptations. But trained athletes are able to recover faster in the areas of heart rate, stroke volume, and cardiac output than non-trained. So what does cardiac output look like at a maximal exercise? So this is a figure that we saw yesterday. We'll just rehash some of it. So at rest here, male and female, about 72 to 75 beats per minute is an average heart rate. Stroke volume hangs around 70 or 60 for females for a lower body size. So we can calculate cardiac output by multiplying the two and getting 4.5 to 5 liters per minute of cardiac output. Okay. I'll note one thing if anyone's curious. We consider a normal heart rate to be anything between 60 to 100, which is a pretty big range, and we'll talk more about that tomorrow because training affects that. So then if we look at what happens during max exercise. So max exercise for a college-age person is about maximal heart rate is about 200. We then have a stroke volume of over 100 mils in males, and so it's not uncommon to have 22 to 25 is another really common number that you'll see as far as the average exercise values for a maximal exercise cardiac output. So let's see how we got there. So this, in this case, again, aerobic training, this is going from rest to a walk, a jog, or run to an all-out maximal exercise, and we'll walk through cardiac output, stroke volume, and heart rate. So at the initiation of exercise, as you start to increase intensity, what we see is we see a relatively rapid increase in cardiac output up till about 40% of VO2 max. At 40%, we see an inflection point here where the slope now changes and it increases less. Okay? So you'll have to look at that and know from essentially resting to standing to doing nothing to about 40% of VO2 max, we get a rapid increase in stroke volume. At about 40%, we have an inflection point that then results in a slower rise in cardiac output for the rest of the duration of the exercise. So let's see why that is, right? So if we can now look at our two components, is heart rate and stroke volume. So if we look at heart rate, what's the heart rate response to incremental exercise? Again, from rest all the way to maximal exercise. You can see that it goes from a normal beat, remember anywhere from 60 to 100, we'll say about 75 here. We have a nice, beautiful linear curve. So as intensity increases, we see a linear increase in heart rate all the way up to maximal heart rate of that individual. Okay. Heart rate is controlled, as you'll remember, by two things. Remember we talked about it being the teeter-totter, right? So we have our parasympathetic and our sympathetic. Parasympathetic can control heart rate in two ways. One, it can increase parasympathetic nervous system activity, which would decrease heart rate, or as what happens with exercise is we remove parasympathetic nervous system activity. So by removing it, we have essentially a negative minus a negative. So if we remove this negative, the increase in heart rate occurs at the beginning. Up to about 100 beats per minute is due only to parasympathetic withdrawal. No sympathetic nervous system stimulation up to 100 beats. Once we get higher than that, then anything over 100 beats is all due to an increase in sympathetic nervous system. So if we then look at stroke volume, so stroke volume, as you can see here, doesn't quite look like heart rate, right? What we have here is a linear increase in stroke volume, and guess what? Just like our cardiac output figure, at 40% of VO2 max, we see an inflection point. However, unlike cardiac output, at 40% of VO2 max, stroke volume plateaus and doesn't increase the rest of exercise, right? So we see a linear increase to 40% of VO2 max. Once we reach that point, we reach the maximal amount of increase in stroke volume that we can do. So 40% of VO2 max is maximal stroke volume. Okay? And we can see that by if we increase intensity, we don't see stroke volume increasing. So as you'll remember from yesterday, stroke volume is regulated by three factors: preload, contractility, and afterload, and that's what we're going to cover in the next video as we dig deeper into stroke volume and then getting into a little bit of blood pressure.